Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the latest patch deployed to EVE Online, Surgical Strike, which was released on April the 15th, 2020. Unlike normal, however, this isn't going to be a read-through of the patch notes. Instead, I'm going to be going through all the changes that were crammed into this patch in detail. That's because this is far bigger than the usual numbers tweaking, and maybe one or two notable mechanical alterations, and instead represents a really big shift in the combat ecosystem that's going to impact the survivability of ships in pretty much all circumstances, even PvE. So strap in and let's work our way through this patch. Okay, so it seems prudent to start exactly where CCP did in their dev blog, with what I've taken to calling the Great Resist nerf. And this consists of reducing the resistance multiplier that's granted by all modules, with the exception of damage controls and reactive armor hardeners, by 20%. This doesn't apply to rigs, boosts, or skill level bonuses, but if you need to put it in a slot on your ship for it to work, it's almost certainly now losing a fifth of its effectiveness. Bam. Something that's crucial to remember when we're talking about resistances though, is that resistance isn't a linear or additive stat, meaning that going from 30 to 31% resistance in a certain damage type increases your EHP by 1.45%, but going from 98% to 99% increases your EHP by 100%. This means that this change is more impactful to ships that already had high resistances, and is conversely less impactful to ships with low resistances. In addition to this, as noted in the dev blog itself, this change is more punishing to ships that spend more slots of their fit on resistance modules. This means that the change has an outsized effect on ships that have high slot counts, such as battleships and battle cruisers. As we can see by this graph, and credit to Sothrasil for making it, the opposite is also true, with Munins only being penalised on their single adaptive and retaining their natural T2 resists, meaning that the Munin only loses about 5% of its EHP in this patch compared to the previous one. Even looking at the worst case scenario though in the ZARM, which relies on multiple blingy hardeners, we aren't at the 20% EHP reduction that's talked about throughout the official blog. Instead, the rough number that we'll be looking at averaged across all fleet PvP fits seems to be at an average of just over 9%. Still a huge number, don't get me wrong, but I wanted to clarify that roughly apparently means within a 50% range in CCP terms. Beyond the obvious EHP implications though, this nerf is going to impact a swath of other things that the PvP meta is built around, most notably logistics, as resists determine what amount of raw DPS a logistics pilot can effectively nullify with their reps, meaning that reps will hold on a target, and that's represented in EHP a second. The reduction in this value is almost directly correlated with the reduction in EHP that the ship experienced, with Munins losing 5.7 rep effectiveness, going from 934 EHP a second per scimitar down to 883, whereas a Guardian loses 18% rep effectiveness, going from tanking 1596 EHP a second per Guardian to 1345. This will likely make volley slightly less crucial to achieving kills during a fight, as it reduces the differential between DPS's ability to burn down a target and the logistics ability to keep them alive, opening up the possibility of burning through reps rather than being forced to try and kill the target before reps can possibly land. The resist nerf won't just impact PvP either, with group PvE content such as incursions and invasions also relying on the mechanics of resist and logistics tanking, meaning that the days of the 3-slot tank Vindicator may be numbered, as people involved will probably have to beef up their fits in order to tank the same amount of damage. It's also likely that this will spill over further, even into solo PvE sectors like high-tier abyssal running or burner mission farming, where the fitting solutions to the problems that CCP have presented are already resting on a knife's edge of viability and might now be unsurvivable. This is very much an area of the game where I'm not an expert, as I don't have any first-hand experience with it, so let me know down in the comments what you've experienced trying to run high-tier abyssals after this patch. And if you are an expert, hey, get in touch, maybe we can do an interview. Overall though, this change is a hard one to get a feel for right now, as it certainly has some positives in that it makes hitting stalemates in combat where neither side can break the other significantly more rare, but equally it serves as a buff to ships that don't rely on traditional tanking methods. Ships that try to outrange their opponents and thus receive no damage while still being able to dish it out are probably the true winners of this change, as are those that can take advantage of the tracking issues of their opponents. They receive all of the upside of their damage now being worth comparatively more, whilst their ability to tank stays the same. Given that ships that operate in this manner, such as the Munin, the Eagle, and to a lesser extent the Ferox, are the cornerstones of the current meta, my concern here is that this will just reinforce the existing paradigm for the time being. Still, it's early days here, so I'm content to run a few fleets and see how this feels in practice. If the end result of fights being bloodier actually does pan out, then regardless of other impacts, I'm probably going to give this one 2 thumbs up. And as I record this, I'm about an hour away from running a Drake fleet, so I'll be able to tell you some of my thoughts on that relatively soon. Anyway, following on from that incredibly wide-ranging change, we have something that's a little more surgical, and that's the alterations that have been made to capital balance. Before we dive into those though, I want to point out the interesting statement made in the blog that lays out CCP's intent to move super capitals to have their focus shifted to dealing damage to capitals and structures, in order to return to a more healthy class diversity in PvP. It's great to see CCP recognise both the issues with super capital balance, and also alongside that lay out a plan for where they want to fit into the future. Hopefully this means that we won't have another 2015 to 2016 shift lined up for the future, where these ships went from having very little point to being the only thing that mattered over the course of one big rework patch. The first change making its way to live with this patch though is the removal of support fighter tubes from super carriers and being replaced by an additional heavy fighter tube. As someone who about a year ago in my Obsolescence of Subcapitals video advocated for the complete removal of all support fighters entirely from the game, this is something that I think is a step in the right direction, as whilst a super can still use a Warp Disruption Burst projector to potentially tackle a few things, it no longer has that inbuilt weapon point support. In theory, this encourages people in super carriers to bring smaller ships along with them that can tackle their targets, and thus allow the huge DPS of the platform to be brought to bear, whilst also giving people that the super carrier is attacking something more appropriate to their weight class to shoot. Hopefully this encourages a more healthy combat ecosystem, where small gangs will still have to deal with the home field advantage of capital support, but won't have to build their compositions solely around either dealing with said support or running away from it, as some level of subcap commitment alongside these capitals will be necessary. Next up is a pure nerf to EHP, with the bonuses to extra large plates and extenders for supers being reduced from 300% to 200%, and for Titans going from 500% to 300%, which combined with the resist nerfs talked about before is looking to be somewhere in the region of a 25 to 35% cut in the total EHP of these ships, which is pretty huge. I assume that this change is made with the intent of reducing the response time that larger groups have to form up and jump in to save a super that was caught under the umbrella, but I have to say I'm skeptical of this making a huge difference in that environment, as from my experience the problem has typically been finding a super carrier that's fucking up hard enough to get caught, rather than finding them and killing them fast enough. Still, I'll make sure to check in with Olmeca at some point and find out what the impact really has been. Following on from that, we have a trio of more minor fighter changes, with long-range fighters taking a 50% explosion radius increase, which is a nerf to application, as this means you now need to have a 50% bigger signature radius for that to not be a component in the damage formula. Short-range fighters get a 50% bump in their base speed, and the Aeon and the Wyvern have had their fighter bays increased in size to decrease the intra-class disparity there. These all seem like fairly healthy changes, bringing supers closer into line with one another, and reducing their ability to hit small things, but also making short-range fighters a little bit better as a token bit of compensation. The real game changer here is the final bullet point, which originally indicated that capital capacitor boosters were going to be limited to 1 per ship of any type, although this was later changed to be a 1 capacitor booster of any size limit applied to the Force Auxiliary hulls. And this means that the quote-unquote master race fits for the Apostle and Minakawa that were designed for subcap supporting roles and relied on an extremely cap-hungry dual rep setup in order to be able to tank a ridiculous amount of DPS, reaching into the 80 to 100,000 range, and now much less sustainable, and more to the point, vulnerable to capacitor warfare from newts in the short term. This is another change that I wholeheartedly agree with, as in most subcap based fights that aren't 250 man plus, your response to a fax would be to either try and move and fight on another grid if you can to separate it from the fleet that it's supporting, or just to try and ignore it and either burn through or volley through its reps. The ability to put a logistics ship on the field that your opponents couldn't interact with meaningfully through either DPS, EWAR or newts really imbalanced the meta of smaller fights in favour of the defender, or at least the group with the biggest cap advantage, and encouraged the heavy disengage focus of subcap doctrine design, as you needed to have an answer for what if the people you're fighting drop supers and fax. Now, whilst I don't expect the changes from this to be immediate, I do wonder if this will bring back newts as an important piece of EWAR to consider bringing as part of a fleet, as it can now be effectively leveraged against what's often an important force multiplier. Wormholes are also going to be somehow even more affected than nullsec, given their reliance on faxes in fights both big and small. So I spoke extensively to Loresco, a member of Hard Knox' theory crafting team recently, and the resulting interview should be out in a few days to provide you with more detail than I possibly could on this topic. Alright, that finishes up the changes made to capitals, but don't think that subcaps are safe, as we have a rather typical complement of balancing tweaks on that side of the aisle as well. This is something I always like and want to give kudos to CCP for doing, because I still remember my time in the CSM where it took a literal year and a half to convince them that changing things somewhat regularly so that people are encouraged to fly different ships was a good idea that added value to the game. We start off with a pretty cool counterbalance to the earlier changes in the form of a 10% flat HP buff to all Tech 1 and faction battleships, which gets their EHP to roughly where it started at before this patch, although with a still diminished resist profile. This also comes with a 30% buff to Scanres, which has been passed along to Black Ops and Marauders as well, bringing them closer to a middle range between capitals and battle cruisers, as opposed to being only a token amount faster at locking than capitals. This will make using them in combat a bit easier, but won't really make them more effective, as the key things that are holding battleships down, namely a lack of mobility, a lack of appropriate support, and vulnerability to capitals, all remain in play. The Munin gets another nerf, its second after the November 2019 changes, reducing its range and damage bonuses to 5% a level, down from 7.5, meaning a 12.5% reduction in its volley, DPS and optimal range from this patch, which is certainly a significant change. But I don't think it will be anywhere close to the death knell for the omnipresent Munin doctrine, which at this point is beginning to remind me of the Ishtar in terms of its resilience to nerfs. I think the problem here is CCP's fundamental misunderstanding of what gives the Munin its power. Whilst volley and range certainly play a part in making it a viable doctrine choice, what makes it truly powerful is the permanent mobility that it offers you on the battlefield. Its high speed, high agility, and most crucially, its big capacitor means you can always move to position yourself into a spot where you feel advantaged, or if you can't find that spot, to break tackle and disengage. Without nerfs to its cap stability or the introduction of better ways to lock down a highly mobile fleet, I don't see the Munin falling out of favour just yet. The Eagle also takes a pair of nerfs, rather oddly in my opinion, as they were considered the soft counter to Munins, but I suppose that CCP is just trying to push the overall power level of the game down so that all of the other untouched ships get a relative buff. And this comes in the form of a nerf to power grid that disrupts the previous standard fit, and a nerf to the base speed, which takes it down to 190 meters a second. This follows a pretty standard template of nerfing that we've seen on other shield ships, and has led to the standard result, with people swapping out damage mod for a fitting mod and then immediately undocking the same ships again. Then we get to the Deimos, which has been given some fitting buffs and a 12.5% total buff to volley and DPS. This makes it even scarier of a threat if it can get into scram range of you, but doesn't do a whole amount to address its problems in doing that, namely its crap-based speed and the relatively piddly capacitor. Still, you can now get the Deimos to do a very weird impression of a cross between the Munin and the Eagle, and I can't say I'm not tempted to try it out. And then, tacked onto the end of all of this, is the announcement that bombs are being nerfed by 20% to account for the 20% resist changes, meaning that relative to the actual numbers talked about earlier, bombs are now going to be slightly weaker in terms of their actual damage output versus the EHP of their target. I have to imagine that this is unintentional, but there's also a non-zero chance that this is intended to try and reduce the power of a traditional hard counter to the battleship fleet in bombers, as there is a couple of sentences kind of implying that CCP wants to see battleships be more prevalent in PvP. The whole dev blog is then rounded off by CCP talking about how they want to bring about a brawler's paradise, more reminiscent of the days where Armageddons and Megathrons traded broadsides dishonourably in low sec, and proceeds to then provide a 15% buff to the damage of all close range T2 ammo, so Conflag, Rage, Void, etc. I have to say this feels like a big miss for me. Whilst I'm almost certainly going to try and use these changes to my advantage at some point, it rewards brawling ships in a scenario where they've already fundamentally won. It doesn't look at the issues surrounding why brawling struggles to get into those positions, and thus why brawling doctrines have fallen out of fashion. Now, there's a ton of other meta things going into that, not least including defensive bubbles and the fact that we're better at positioning and getting into systems than we were before. We have a lot more tools for mobility than we did in the past, but the real key in my opinion is the fact that simply there's no utility gained in bringing a high DPS doctrine to a fight. In the past, this would have allowed you to potentially grind down a structure faster or to deal with hostile dreads that are doing the grinding. Now the objectives are decided around a much larger grid, with much lower DPS requirements to effectively progress them, and because of this, mobility and range have much more significant weight to them than they did in the past, regardless of any advances in doctrine design and FCing skill. In order to stop this change from having an outsized impact on high sec through suicide ganking, freighters have been given a HP buff to compensate for this, so you should live for exactly the same time as before, or slightly less if your attackers use T1 guns. Overall though, I'd say that the real winners out of this specific change are going to be the people who hunt capitals in bombers, with them getting a 15% bonus to Rage Torpedo DPS, which they can readily apply to their targets, and their method of engagement allowing them to pretty much always be in a brawling range. When you combine this with other various nerfs to capital survivability, I would expect a pretty substantial uptick on the amount of them going down over the next couple of months as a result of this. Alright, so with that we come to the end of all of the changes that have been brought together in this patch. And trying to reflect on all of them as a whole is really difficult because there's a lot of moving parts here, and the second and third order effects of what these changes will be on the meta isn't at all clear right now. But what I can say is that I'm happy to see CCP actively trying to really change the way the fleet and PvP systems work from a very fundamental level, this is a shift that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. And whilst I was initially reading this, I actually mentioned to a few friends that it felt like I was reading a patch from, say, 2007, 2008, where CCP would just introduce these huge lists of like ground-shaking changes and then just expect the players to figure them all out themselves. And it's really nice to have a return to that. But I also recognise that that's not necessarily what everyone's looking for in the game. I'm sure some people didn't like it because it's very, very nerf heavy, or because the knock-on effects are something that CCP didn't really seem to consider a huge amount. If that's the case, please feel free to leave a comment below and try and really start up a conversation about what you liked and didn't like about the patch. I always love to see that. I also, as always, have to give out a special thanks to our Crassuses, Brood from Northern Coalition Dot, Zolka Lando and Jessica, as well as to our other $5 and above patrons in January Valentine, Big Bada Boom, Czar, Dunk Dinkle, Miss Moses, Kem, the Ashfell Celestial Academy, Closer Canty, Crazy Daisy, Ulrich Bluthers, and Omniscious Shardan. If you want to join them in supporting the channel yourself, you can either check out the Patreon link in the description below, or if you'd like, just share the video with some other people who you think might enjoy it, because advertisement is always the best thing you can give me. Until next time though, have a good day and fly smart.